Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, as you probably well know, the world is currently without a James Bond actor at present, after Daniel Craig stepped down from the role after No Time to Die. And the British media has fairly recently been full of quite a lot of rampant speculation as to who the next James Bond might be. Normally, they tend to obsess around named actors like, say, Henry Cavill, which is slightly ironic if you look at sort of historically who's been chosen as James Bond, because generally speaking, they were people that nobody had ever heard of. It would have been a bit like in the 1960s when the first James Bond, Sean Connery, was cast, if they'd said, and the new James Bond is John Gielgud. Though, come to think of it, I'd have quite liked to have seen John Gielgud say, "The name is Bond, James Bond." I think that would have been quite amusing. But anyway, I digress. In my video today, to celebrate the fact that we don't yet have a new James Bond, and to celebrate the rampant speculation, I'm going to be reviewing 25 years of Bond cars, the Top Gear documentary they did in the run-up to the Bond film Skyfall, well, back a few years ago now. Now, this is an absolutely brilliant documentary, and I guess you could kind of say that it was created a little bit as kind of promotional material for Skyfall, which in itself is not a bad thing because it actually shows you how they filmed the opening car chase scene, which is absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's gone down as one of the best sort of opening sequences in the James Bond film canon. So to actually see how they filmed it, how they got, Land Rover versus the Audi A4, and then they went on to bikes, and they went on to the train, and you see how it all progresses. It's actually quite cool. I have to say as well, the best bit about this documentary, though, is the historical bits. Now, as you've probably gathered, I'm a bit of a history nerd, but even I think people that don't particularly enjoy history would have quite liked the way that sort of Top Gear looked at the way cars have been used in the historical Bond films. The best bit by far, I think, is the bit with the Aston Martin DB5, and it's not surprising really they started off with the DB5 at the start of the documentary, and they kind of ignore the I think it was was it I can't even remember what it was called now. But the original Bond car he drives in Doctor No is far from impressive. It's just like your average British sports car, which they had to rent apparently by the day, which just shows you how far Bond's come. When now they actually pay obviously for most of the film's budget just by sort of promotional material and by sponsoring stuff. Um, but yeah, it's fascinating to see the behind the scenes stuff. And Richard Hammond, who narrates this particular documentary, does a really good job of reading out some of the personal letters that went back and forth between Aston Martin and Gabby Broccoli, I think it was, as they tried to kind of negotiate the use of the Aston Martin DB5 in Goldfinger. It's quite funny. Apparently, Aston originally said they'd have to basically buy it for, I think it was 9 grand. That was how much the car cost, just retail. And apparently, the Bond producer slammed the phone down, but they kind of kept chipping away, chipping away. And finally, they managed to get Aston to sell them like an ex-demo one for I think about 3 or 4 grand. But then I kind of felt a bit sorry for Aston because it turns out they then spent about 26 grand on putting all the gadgets and all the stuff in it. Obviously, not all of them actually worked. I don't think it actually genuinely had machine guns in it, but they had to obviously trick it up for the film. I thought if they were willing to spend 26 grand on just modifying it, well, they couldn't spend 9 grand on the original. I can kind of see why you wouldn't want to spend 9 grand, but it wasn't like they were short of cash, was it? But anyway, it's absolutely brilliant, and I like some of the behind the scenes tweaks as well. Apparently, a lot of the gadgets came out of just rampant kind of fantasizing on behalf of the producers. Apparently, I can't remember who it was now. I think it was Guy Hamilton. I think he said that the idea for the spinning number plate came from him because he was always getting parking tickets, and he thought it would be funny if you could get a parking ticket and then spin the number plate and drive off, so you could have like a fake one underneath. It's actually quite funny that James Bond doesn't try and use that in the film because I could definitely see Sean Connery's James Bond using his gadgets for personal advantage. In fact, doesn't even say in the film, the tracking system would enable a man to stop off for a quick one en route. So, yeah, I could definitely see him doing that. The other bits that are quite cool as well. And they actually got Roger Moore. They actually interviewed him. He always seems quite, or always did seem quite laid back about talking about James Bond. It's quite unusual in that regard. Most James Bond actors kind of get so fed up with being asked questions about Bond, they kind of don't ever talk about it after they stop being James Bond. Um, but yeah, he always seems quite relaxed about being James Bond. And he talked about how when they filmed the famous corkscrew stunt in Man with the Golden Gun, where the car actually, flips right over, like barrel rolls. Um, he actually talked about how on the day apparently the stuntman was injured, and so the mechanic said, "Well, I'll do it." He'd never done anything like that before, but he was like, "Yeah," and it wasn't an easy stunt. I mean, apparently it had to be. They actually was the first stunt in a film where they used kind of like computers to generate a kind of image to work out, exactly what would happen. They kind of simulated it first to work out really if it was actually possible. Um, so they'd done that, but obviously it still needed somebody in the car, and they'd worked out that you needed to be going exactly 49 miles an hour, and you had to have the steering wheel in the middle of the car. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. You just, spin over and crash on your roof, presumably. So they tried it like that. And this mechanic had never done any stunts before, but he just put his foot down, went down there, presumably kept it at 49 miles an hour, and did it perfectly. And apparently, Roger Moore said that Cally Broccoli went up and very generously, although to be fair, the man had very much deserved it. Handed him like a roll of $100 bills or something. And apparently, the man just looked at him and said, "Can I do it again?" which is a wonderful thing to say, isn't it? But yeah, it's a wonderful documentary, and of course the piece de resistance of it is they do various kind of stunts throughout, um, where they kind of try and recreate various Bond moments. Say, for instance, you're probably, if you're a James Bond fan, familiar with in Die Another Day when in Die Another Day, his Aston Martin can turn invisible, and Richard Hammond attempts to recreate this with a Ford Transit van and kind of like LCD screens on the side. And to be fair to him, it does kind of turn invisible, but not enough that you'd actually be unnoticeable. It's quite funny, actually. It does illustrate that such a thing might possibly be possible on a James Bond kind of world, and certainly at long range it would be very difficult to work out where something was, but at close range it just looks like a van with TV screens on the side of it. But it is very, very funny, and they do it very much tongue-in-cheek to show you that it's kind of possible but also doesn't really work. But then again, rockets in a car really wouldn't work, would they? I mean, the car would shake all over the place even when one was launched. So James Bond's never been that realistic in terms of stuff you could actually put in a car. But never mind. But the best and the biggest stunt they do is the bit with the Lotus. Obviously, if you're a James Bond fan, you're well aware that in the Spy Who Loved Me, James Bond's Lotus Esprit is also a submarine. So he drives it off the end of the pier when he's being chased by a helicopter, and it goes underwater and turns into a submarine. Now, apparently, they didn't try and do this in real life for the film. I mean, it would have been very costly and very difficult, if not at the time impossible. So what they actually did was quite clever. They just used the shell of a lotus in the water for like the big kind of like scenic shots, and they had two divers apparently inside it, so just sort of swimming along, sort of manoeuvring it. And then for more complicated stuff, like when he uses gadgets, they actually used a little model. And it looks brilliant. I mean, you couldn't really tell in the film at all that it wasn't actually underwater. I mean, I always assumed it wasn't, but you can definitely, you could definitely imagine that it's actually happening, which of course is the main thing. But apparently for the show, they wanted to see if it was actually possible. So they use a Lotus. They don't use a Lotus Esprit. They use a Lotus. What do they call it? Excel, which is like a cheaper version of that car. And they modified it. I think they have put something like concrete in the tires or something to make it heavy enough so it would actually go underwater. But it was absolutely brilliant, and it works. I mean, it leaked, but only a little bit. And considering how Lotus build quality isn't always entirely up to scratch, particularly with old Lotuses, it definitely proves the point, and it's fantastic. It doesn't look like the film. I mean, it's not as romantic as the film because it was wasn't filmed in Italy. It was filmed on like a reservoir in like middle of England. But still, it's really, really, really cool. And they very sensibly left this bit till last, so it's the last thing you see um, the documentary. It's brilliant, and Richard Hammond was so chuffed it worked. It's actually really heartwarming to see how excited he is. He's excited, probably more excited actually than the viewer is, to go, wow, you can actually make a car into a submarine, and it looks like the Bond one. Um, you couldn't probably use that version of the car as a getaway vehicle, because if it's got like heavy material. I don't think it was actually concrete, come to think of it, but it was certainly very heavy in the tyres. It probably wouldn't handle particularly well or go very fast. But yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, that was my review of 25 years of Bond cars. That was absolutely cracking documentary, and if you can get a version of it and watch it, it's fantastic. I would totally recommend it. It's very un-Top Geary in the sense that it's less loud-mouthed than Top Gear normally is, or certainly that sort of era of Top Gear was. It feels very much like Richard Hammond. It wasn't coerced into doing it at all. He was genuinely excited to be reviewing all these Bond cars, looking at the behind-the-scenes stuff. Um, and there's this lovely moment when Michael G. Wilson, who obviously helped to produce Skyfall, is taking him on a tour of the set, and he takes him, and they're in like Constantinople, well, not Constantinople, they're in Istanbul, but they're in the old Constantinople bit of Istanbul, so with like all the lovely old architecture, and he's taking him through this like archway, and he's sort of saying, we can't possibly change anything. We have to have people, sort of like see to everything, because obviously this is all very old. And he said, this bit's Roman and this bit's Byzantine, and this bit we think's more kind of early medieval. And he's taking him through all this, this supposedly historic architecture, and then they walk out like ahead of the camera, which is behind them, and you see Richard Hammond literally just starts to chuckle, and then the camera comes out, and you realise you've walked through a set. It's not actually real, this archway at all. And Richard Hammond said, I thought it was weird. He sort of thought, wow, he doubles up as a tour guide as well as a producer. But it's just a lovely shot, and it's brilliant just to see how enthusiastic everybody was when they were filming. It's absolutely lovely. So yeah, I would totally recommend this documentary. Yeah, if you'd like to follow the channel, yeah, you can subscribe, obviously, down below. I hope you enjoyed what you saw, and you can also follow me on Twitter. There is a link in the description below. I tend to talk about lots of different documentaries, like wildlife ones, science ones, yeah, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, if you've got any suggestions, stick them in the description below, and I'll try and review them as soon as possible. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.